Well, we've given it the Cambridge 2 minutes to allow everyone to join us, and a really warm welcome to you. Whether you're joining us from Cambridge, Canberra, or the Canary Islands, you're really welcome. It's fantastic to have you with us. This is the second session now of our autumn series, Humanity Matters, Re-Enchanting Homo Sapiens. A warm welcome to those of you who've joined us for the second time. And also an equally warm welcome if it's your first time with us. We hope you enjoy the evening. Hope you find it a stimulating discussion as well after the presentation. A note on format. This is just to say that Andrew will speak first of all for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a 5-minute break, an intermission. Feel free during that time to give your eyes a rest or to formulate some questions for the final part, which will be the Q&A. Having said those things about format, just briefly to introduce Andrew, for those who may not know him, Andrew is the Director of Apologetics at Christian Heritage here in Cambridge. And this is being beamed to you from the 12th century Norman Church, which is the home of Christian Heritage. Andrew, for 21 years, together with his wife, Helen, was part of the L'Abri ministry in southern England, based in Gretham in Hampshire. And in that context, he lectured widely on issues around culture and history, the history of ideas. And so it's a great pleasure to have him with us tonight to bring some light to the subject of humanity in the interior castle. So Andrew, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Josh, and welcome to all of you who have joined me for this session in this digital space. I reach out to you even as you reach out and listen to me. Thank you for joining. So in this series, we're asking what I think is one of the critical questions of our time, perhaps the most critical, which is this: what is a human? And it's interesting that the traditional line of approach is to see our species as having a without, the body, and a within, often referred to as the spirit or the soul. Now, I think for many today, the terms soul and spirit are much too weighted to the religious, but I want to suggest we can use other words to describe the same within dimension. Words like consciousness, the mind, self-awareness, all getting to the same thing: the inside, the within, or the inner of human life and existence. And it's interesting that everyone carries this sense of having an outer, the body, and an inner. Even naturalists carry this sense. And it's interesting that cognitive psychology has uncovered this, that we intuitively see ourselves in those terms. So it's like this kind of dualistic thinking, the within, the without, comes very naturally to us. Now, as we consider these two aspects, the within and the without, the embodied side is much more straightforward to grasp. We can literally do this. We can grasp our without, our bodies. It's subject to the sensate, and that makes it empirically verifiable. You go a week without a shower, and you can smell yourself. Go a day without eating, and you can even hear yourself. I call it talking in tummies. Now, the past 400 years have been a great age of discovery concerning the human body. And the door to this discovery was open when certain prohibitions on dissection were relaxed. So there was now widespread use of cadavers. There's a Rembrandt painting of a cadaver becoming popular in his time. Interesting, even as far back as the 16th century, Michelangelo, the great artist and sculptor, he observed the human body, I would say like no one else ever had. And he translated his observation of the body into his various sculptures. Some historians speculate that at night, Michelangelo would sneak into the mortuary and get a body and peel back layers of skin and muscle to help him understand human form better. Now, the more we've come to understand about the body, the more remarkable they become. And here we say thank you to modern science for this uncovering. In his wonderful little book, The Body, a Guide for Occupants, Bill Bryson, the writer, describes it in these terms. The body is often likened to a machine, but it is so much more than that. It works 24 hours a day for decades without, for the most part, needing regular servicing or the installation of spare parts. It runs on water and a few organic compounds, is soft and rather lovely, is accommodatingly mobile and pliant, reproduces itself with enthusiasm, makes jokes, feels affection, appreciates a red sunset and a cooling breeze. How many machines do you know that can do any of that? There is no question about it. You are truly a wonder. But then so, it must be said, is an earthworm. Very interesting. So, I would agree with Bryson. You and I are truly a wonder in terms of our body. You just look at something like blood. In a moment, your body, I'm told, makes 1 million red blood cells coursing through your veins, keeping you alive. Now, that's a very high level of productivity. And if you've had an unproductive day today, I'd put that on your pipe and smoke it. At least you produced billions of red blood cells. Now, I would suggest, as marvelous as the body is, it's not that part of us that enchants us. And that's because at the end of the day, the building blocks of the human body are cells and atoms. And these are a collection of what we might call inert components. They're actually comprised of the same kind of stuff you'd find in a pile of dirt. Now, mind you, atoms and cells are still remarkably sophisticated entities. And apparently your body is comprised, listen to this, of 7 billion atoms. That's a 7 with 27 zeros behind it. Now that's an impressive number. But don't forget that every one of those atoms are mindless particles. They're incapable of a single thought or intention. And that's why intuitively, something from within us says that atoms are not us. We look at the components that make up dirt and conclude that we're not from there. I'd suggest we have the kind of existence that actually sees matter as a stranger. There's something uncommon about it to us. We're possessed of a sense that we don't entirely belong to that realm. As Thomas Ligeti puts it, no creature caged in a zoo even knows what it is to exist, nor does it crow about being superior to any other kind of thing, whether animal, vegetable, or mineral. As for us humans, we reek of our sense of being special, of transcending this realm, of not entirely belonging to it. So I would say everything points to the fact that humans naturally lean towards an enchantment narrative for our existence that's more than atoms. And this links to the other side of our intuitive sense of what we are. We have a without, but we have also this sense of a within, the interior side of us. And when we come to this aspect of us, we're wrestling with something much more elusive than the body. Where the body is within our grasp, this inner aspect of us is beyond our grasp. So what is our within? Or let me rephrase the question like this. What is consciousness? Now we need to begin with the assertion that despite the elusiveness of consciousness, it connects to the deepest, most essential part of what it means to be human. And it's because we have consciousness that we carry a sense of being somebody, and specifically a human somebody. That's what consciousness carries us in. So because we're self-conscious, we carry a sense that we are real, live selves, persons. And to ourselves, we're actually the most real thing going. No one can deny that about their sense of self. So self-consciousness gives us the ability to say, I. We start from first person consciousness. Now, looking at what consciousness is raises many, many questions. What is it? Where is it? How does it work? Some would ask, is there too much of it? What some call a damning surplus of consciousness? And then the big one today is this: is consciousness the brain? Now, what's rather striking of late is that we've become, as a culture, very conscious of consciousness. You look back on the history of philosophy, and this topic wasn't much discussed. It was almost the prolegomena, the starting point. You had it and didn't talk much about it. The contrast today is that we're utterly obsessed with consciousness. The German neurophilosopher Thomas Metzinger has dubbed our age as the consciousness culture. Interesting. And it's worth asking why. Why have we become a consciousness culture to the point of obsession? And I would suggest it's because consciousness poses the final frontier for scientific investigation. No one denies we have it, but the question is, how do we account for it? Now, because of the dominance of the hardware account I talked about last week, consciousness has to be reduced to the brain. So materialism, its ideology, says that the great absolute, that is, everything with nothing left out, is in a physical form and is physically determined. So anything beyond the scope of physics is dismissed by a consistent physicalist. So the kind of reality envisioned by naturalism can't allow for the independent reality of the mind, what is sometimes being called the ghost in the machine. And that's why today consciousness is being pursued along the line of this inquiry like never before. And I think that accounts for our obsession with it. E.O. Wilson puts it like this in his book, The Meaning of Human Existence. He says, no scientific quest is more important to humanity than to nail the phantom of conscious thought. Everyone, scientists, philosophers, and religious believers alike, can agree with the neurobiologist Gerald Edelman that consciousness is the guarantor of all we hold to be human and precious. Its permanent loss is considered to be the equivalent of death, even if the body persists in its vital signs. So an acknowledgement by Wilson that consciousness is precious, but he's saying naturalism has to root every aspect of this part of our humanness in the materialist realm. And so our consciousness needs to be spun into matter. So that means consciousness must somehow have emerged in the flow of an evolutionary development. So the big narrative goes something like this. There have been a series of massive jumps. Billions of years after Earth made a jump from being lifeless to having life, human beings made a jump from not being conscious to being conscious. And of course, it also means, the naturalist view, that consciousness must somehow emerge from our brains. There's no option but to make consciousness an emergent feature of this part of our bodies. Now Francis Crick, the English biologist who together with James Watson discovered the DNA structure here in Cambridge, he was very committed to this. In his book, published in 1994, The Astonishing Hypothesis, Crick proposes that there must be a neural mechanism in the brain that is the cause of our sense of self. And he argued because consciousness is a purely biological phenomenon, it can be identified and measured like any other phenomenon in nature. And it's actually since around that time that the search has been on to find an account for consciousness in the brain. And it wasn't long ago that Steven Pinker pronounced with great pomp that cognitive neuroscience is showing that the self too is just another network of brain systems. Now, I'd suggest that that pronouncement was a little premature because neuroscience is itself admitting that they're attempting to show it, but not making much inroads, still so much they don't know. Now, when we think about the brain, there's no doubting the marvel of it. There's a picture of one, nothing spectacular about it on the outside, barely 3 pounds. It looks to be shaped like a giant walnut. And we're told it has the consistency of a soft-boiled egg. And that 3 pounds of spongy mass sits between your ears in silence and darkness. It's never felt sunlight, never felt the breeze. And as Bill Bryson puts it, to your brain, the world is just a stream of electrical pulses, like taps of a Morse code. But of course, what a stream it is. Some say that this spongy mass is the most complex mechanism in the whole universe. Apparently, it churns through more information in 30 seconds than the Hubble Space Telescope has processed in 30 years. Now, that's because there's 100 billion neurons firing within that spongy mass. And each of these are connected with thousands of other neurons. And if you do the math, apparently equates to trillions and trillions of connections. The neuroscientist David Eagleman says that there are as many connections in a single cubic centimeter of brain tissue as there are stars in the Milky Way. Well, that just about blows all the neurons in my brain, just trying to think about that many connections, the sheer scope of this mechanism. Now, if our within consciousness is mere brain function, consciousness must be reduced to that spongy mass. And again, it leaves the question as to how consciousness and self-awareness emerge from the brain. And even a more basic question, why does it do that? Now, these matters and questions are beyond me. I'm no neuroscientist, but I think one thing it's easy to assert about consciousness and the self is that it's not a material substance in the brain. It's not something you can put as a smear in a slide and then blow it up with an electron microscope for a peep at it. And of course, here we've moved on from Descartes, the French philosopher. He actually thought the soul, the within, was located in the pineal gland, of all places. But then back in the 19th century, the German physician and biologist Rudolf Virchow quipped that he had opened up thousands of corpses, but he says, I never managed to see a soul. And that's true because consciousness is not a material entity. It's unseen. And no one should rush by that point. It's not a material entity. Now, what consciousness generates is real enough. It generates our thoughts, feeling, perception. And of course, a thought, if you think about it, is not physiological. It's something which is real, but beyond the sensate. You can't see a thought or touch it. So too with consciousness. It's real, but beyond the sensory and the seen. Now, what I want to do, and this really is the structure of the rest of the talk, is I want to state two what I'm calling uncomfortable conclusions about consciousness. Two uncomfortable conclusions about consciousness. The first is getting to grips with consciousness is to grapple with the ungraspable. It's a bit of a tongue twister. Getting to grips with consciousness is to grapple with the ungraspable. Despite being a consciousness culture, as we probe it, we are coming to know more about what we don't know than what we do know. And many neuroscientists are clear on this point. It becomes the ever-growing mystery. And I'm saying that because of the nature of what consciousness is. To grapple with it is to grapple with the ungraspable. And why is that? Well, because in its very nature, consciousness is beyond our grasp. And you can think about it in this way. Our very sense of self, call it self-awareness, is tied up with our consciousness. I am a self-conscious being. And being a self, we never get beyond ourselves. It's the starting point. George Sarkadakis puts this well in his book on artificial intelligence. He says, where are we when we look at us? How can the subject become the object and vice versa? How can we be in two different places and still be one and the same? That's from his book, In Our Own Image. So as we pursue an understanding of consciousness, the self, which is the one doing the investigation, is always the central characters. So we who are the explorers of consciousness can never escape being the subject. So that means we can't become the object of our investigation. It's impossible. Or think about it like this. It's impossible for us to step outside of our consciousness to get a look at what's going on in our minds. The mind never reveals itself to us from the outside. I like to think of the eye as an analogy for this. It's impossible for the eye to see itself. If I took my eye out of the socket of my skull right now and turned it around, there'd be no eye there. The eye cannot see itself. Well, so it is with mind and consciousness. Yes, it's possible to view the brain from the outside, but we can only inspect our minds from within. As Richard David Precht put it, the German philosopher, my thinking is the only window into my existence. So think about it like this. You're at Addenbrooke's famous hospital here in Cambridge, and you're going through the MRI machine, which is going to map what's going on in your brain. And as you're passing through the machine, you have some very awful, unpleasant thoughts about the radiographer. You think to yourself, that guy was so ugly. He has the kind of face only the mother could love. Now, the MRI, as you thought, those terrible thoughts, would show up where brain activity was occurring, but it couldn't ever disclose the content of your mind. Only you, the subject, could disclose that. And that's why on this matter, Ian McGilchrist comments, seeing the brain structure is just easier, he said. And he means easier than uncovering mind and consciousness. So we have to say that science cannot introspectively examine the nature of the subject or of consciousness. And that's why George Zarinkakis calls it the paradox of paradoxes. Now, it's interesting, back in the 19th century, Darwin was aware of this. He could see that the mind couldn't be taken on what he called a frontal assault, because you can't see it from the outside. You can't take it on from the front. But it's interesting, today, despite that conclusion, science will not admit defeat. E.O. Wilson writes this, neuroscientists who are relentlessly bottom up as opposed to top down will have none of this. And that's what I've just mentioned. They have no illusions about the difficulty of the task, understanding that mountains are not provided with escalators built for dreamers. They agree with Darwin that the mind is a citadel that cannot be taken by frontal assault. They have set out instead to break through to its inner recesses with multiple probes along the ramparts, opening breaches here and there, and by technical ingenuity and force, enter and explore whatever space is found to maneuver. Interesting. William H. Calvin is a neuroscientist at the University of Washington, and he calls this quest the janitor's dream. Evocative metaphor, the janitor's dream. To Calvin, conscience is a janitor who's uncomfortable being held down in what he calls the dark basement of chemistry or the sub-basement of physics. And science hopes that from this basement, consciousness will be able to emerge into a brightly lit room on the top floor. And that's why at the moment, there is a direct assault, a frontal assault underway to get to grips with consciousness. A huge player in this is what's known as the BAM project, the Brain Activity Map, sponsored by the Kavli Foundation. From their website, you can read, despite more than a century of study, neuroscientists lack a fundamental understanding of how the brain gives rise to complex thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that make us human. And then it says in 2011, neuroscientists and nanoscientists had an idea for revolutionizing our understanding of the brain. Now that idea is a national challenge as President Obama's Brain Initiative seeks to decipher the neural code that gives rise to our perceptions and experience. So the goal of BAM is nothing less than a map, a total map of the activity of every neuron in real time. And actually BAM says a lot of this technology is going to have to be developed on the job. And they're very clear. This isn't going to come easy because it's dealing with mass neuronal activity, which is so elaborate, we can't even conceive of it at the moment, let alone write it down. So we're going for the frontal approach in the hope, as E.O. Wilson says, that somehow it will emerge. We'll get an explanation for consciousness, the janitor's dream. It'll go up to the top floor. But I think, and a philosopher and a theologian, I think, would argue this clearly, that that is not possible. The frontal assault won't work because consciousness is ungraspable, because you can't see the mind from the outside. My second conclusion is this. If consciousness is the brain, then there is no real you. If consciousness is the brain, that is, it's reduced to neural activity, then there's no real you. Bruce Hidd is a distinguished academic in this country, and he's the director of the Bristol Cognitive Development Center. And he wrote a book a few years back that sums it up very well. The title of the book is The Self-Illusion: Why There's No You Inside Your Head. The self-illusion, why there's no you inside your head. If consciousness and the self are within is reducible to the brain, then there's one unavoidable conclusion. I'm not me, and you're not you. And that means the sense of self that we carry, all of us, is delusional. It's merely a trick of the brain. As Thomas Ligotti puts it, he's pithy with his sentences, there is no you that lives, only a body going about its business of being alive and obeying biology. And he also wrote, what is most uncanny about the self is that no one has yet been able to present the least evidence of it. Like the soul, that figure of speech which has long since been snickered out of existence, the self may be felt, but never be found. No one has been able to present the least evidence of it, and therefore, Ligotti is concluding, it's not real. It's interesting to me that it tends to be the philosophers that have the courage to name this uncomfortable conclusion. There are some exceptions, but scientists tend to dispassionately go about their work without naming this obvious implication. It was actually way back in 1847 when the German philosopher Julius Bonson, he's only 17 years old at the time, and he comes up with this conclusion and he writes it out. Man is a self-conscious nothing. And he became a great philosopher. Now, that's not a thought that's likely to help the mental health of a teenager with a bit of self-doubt. Man is a self-conscious nothing. It's not something you want to say to your kids as you tuck them up at bed at night. Oh, bless you, you little self-conscious nothing. And when you wake up in the morning, you won't be real either. Not exactly a feel-good narrative. In the late 19th century, an Austrian physicist and philosopher called Ernst Mach made the same point. For Mach, using the word I to refer to ourselves was deeply problematic. Why? Because he said the ego is not a definite, unalterable, sharply bounded unity. There is no I in the human brain, only a jumble of sensations in the animated exchange with the elements of the outside worlds. And his famous statement on the self was this: the ego is unsavable. That's the uncomfortable conclusion if we reduce consciousness to the brain. In his book, Being No One, think of that title, Being No One, published in 2004, the German neurophilosopher Thomas Metzinger published a theory for how he saw the brain manufacturing the subjective sense of our existence, giving this sense of being a discrete self. And for Metzinger, a human being is not a person, but merely a mechanistically functioning phenomenal self-model that simulates a person. Now, Metzinger argues that you can't know what you really are, because then you would know there's nothing to know and nothing to know it. So rather than be know-nothings, we exist in a condition of what he describes as naive realism, because we can never know there's nothing to know. He's basically saying we have to live as though we were a somebody, even though we're nothing, a brain trick. And in a lecture at the University of California, a little bit after that, Berkeley, Metzinger referred to the tragedy of the ego. And he talked about our captivity in the illusion of a self, even though there's a no one to have this illusion. That's a key phrase there. Captivity in the illusion of a self, and there's no one actually to have that illusion. Now, I'd suggest that's a pretty disenchanted account of what a human is. Basically, you, your sense of you, is an illusion pretending to be somebody. I don't know about you, but that's enough to drive me mad, or at least to reach for a cheap bottle of scotch or cider every night. That's not feel-good stuff. As Pink Floyd put it in one of their great albums, that's enough to land you on the dark side of the moon, with their telling little phrase, "The lunatic is in my head." So it's not the kind of account that's going to help with growing mental health issues today. You are a self-conscious nothing. Now, I say this next point with great sensitivity. I think this account that we're self-conscious nothings, we're nobodies, begins to make sense for me a little bit of the culture of self-harm we see all around us today. Rising numbers of people, mainly women, but men are beginning to do it more and more. And they self-harm by cutting themselves. They cut themselves until the blood begins to flow. And it almost looks to me like a kind of re-enchantment strategy. This message that we're only bodies with the illusion of a self makes us want to cut into us to see what we are. I think it may also account for the ubiquity of tattoos. Please don't misunderstand me. It's not a diatribe against them. But in a world where we're told that we're basically illusions, it makes us want to mark existence onto our skin, to symbolize existence there. A show and tell of our self-awareness, how we see ourselves. And I wonder again if it's not because in the air there's growing doubts about the nature of consciousness, the nature of the self. So these are the two uncomfortable conclusions. The first for science, that it's ungraspable, the very nature of what it is. And then the second is, if you follow it down the line of your consciousness is your brain, you're a self-conscious nothing. Well, that leads me now to engage the better account. And this is an account that affirms that there is something about a human that really is elusive. So our consciousness, our self-sense, our within, isn't within our grasp, but it's very important to make clear that elusive isn't necessarily illusion. It's only within the hardware account that everything must submit to the scientific method. Otherwise, it's not real. It's elusive. So therefore, it's illusion. I'd suggest that the better account says that we have consciousness, not because the brain is playing a trick on us. No, rather, consciousness is elusive because it's true to who and what we really are. We have a self that really exists. And this is such a profound mystery that it's elusive, it's ungraspable. So here in this account, we have the assertion that our self is real, and our self is tied to a real consciousness. And all of this works beyond the borders of the material. So this sense we have intuitively, all of us, naturally, that we're not from here, that we're special in Ligotti's words, that we're strangers to the inert components of dirt, atoms. That is really true to what we are. So rather than explaining consciousness away as an illusion, I'd suggest that the inference to the best explanation is to take it seriously. Now, of course, an inference isn't a proof, but that's not a problem. Because of what consciousness is, we cannot grasp it. And neuroscience itself can't prove consciousness, but it has made the inference that therefore it's an illusion. I'm saying, why go in that direction? Take it the other way. The reason we can't root consciousness and selfhood in the brain is because there's more to reality than matter, and more to the reality of us. And I'd say if we take a close look at our within, of our minds, of our consciousness, and of our self-awareness, it looks like the inference of naturalism should fall on its sword. I think it takes an unnecessary inference to say it's just an illusion. The better account says, yes, elusive but real, because there's more to reality than matter. There's more to us than the brain and the body. We have a real within. And I would say if naturalism refuses to fall on its sword, then it needs to go the distance with the philosophers of pessimism and assert the inevitable conclusion. What's that? That we are self-conscious nothings. And then science needs to do something to help us live with that, if it's going to drive it in that direction. Now, in the better account, I'd suggest that to engage consciousness is to see the wonder of it. And it's here where the ennobling, the enchantment occurs. The great early church father and theologian Augustine, Saint Augustine, as he's often called, saw the immensity of our within. It goes all the way through his Confessions. He writes there, "Who can map out the various forces at play in one's soul? Man is of great depth, O Lord. The hairs of his head are easier by far to count than his feeling, the movements of his heart." So let me briefly, as I finish, make a case for the wonder of consciousness in terms of how it works and what it's for. I can't say what it is, but this is partly what it's for. First of all, consciousness allows for awareness. It allows for awareness. It's consciousness that makes the world appear to us as it appears, giving us an awareness of color that we can be aware of and admire, of shape, dimension, an awareness of danger, of horror, of suffering, of beauty. And this awareness means that we can reflect on these things. We can write poetry about them or philosophical textbooks. As we saw last week, we can look up at a sky filled with stars and be aware of ourselves as small and fragile within the vastness. And back to Heschel's insight last week, an ant, he said, is never stricken with amazement, nor does a star consider itself a non-entity, because nothing else in nature has awareness. So we have it like nothing else. And this awareness that consciousness is for means we're aware of ourselves. So we appear to ourselves as we appear. So it allows for self-awareness that I am. And this gives us a life of our own. I am, I think, I do. And it's also the possibility to mind ourselves, to introspect on what's going on inside of us. Now that's a capacity nature doesn't have. It lacks such an awareness. Think about it like this. If Homo sapiens went extinct tomorrow, there's no organism on this planet that would even notice. They would have no awareness of it. It would just happen. Secondly, a case for the wonder of consciousness, it allows for a connection to the external world. It's just extending what I've just said. Whatever consciousness is, it creates distance. And that's because consciousness is not of nature, so there's distance between consciousness and other. As the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber said, every I carries a sense of self that's not included in the worlds. Every I carries a sense of self that is not included in the worlds. This is one of the defining features of the human condition. We can stand back from the world. We can stand back from ourselves even. We can stand back from the immediacy of experience. You can put it like this: consciousness allows us to rise above the world. There's the distance. Now, Emily Dickinson reflects this wonderfully in her brief poem, "The Brain is Wider Than the Sky." And by brain, really, she means consciousness. And actually, we need poetry to get at the wonder of what consciousness does here. Follow this poem with me, it's short. The brain is wider than the sky. For put them side by side, the one the other will include with ease, and you beside. Our brain and consciousness is bigger than the expanse of the sky. Put them together, we can include that as we reflect on it, as we have awareness of it, and as we connect with it. And then thirdly, as I finish, a brief case for the wonder of consciousness. It allows for humans to engage horizons beyond the borders of nature. It's interesting, you think of animals, their so-called existence is relatively uncomplicated. You think about a rabbit, for them it's all about trying to survive for the day. That means finding enough green grass to munch on. They're going to do well in this country. It's also about avoiding death, avoid the tire of the car and avoid foxes. And then it's about reproducing, something rabbits are wonderful at. Yeah, it's a bit traumatic in places, but it's relatively uncomplicated. Now, clearly, human consciousness is for so much more than bare life survival. It's interesting. Bill Bryson picks this up in his book, The Body. It's a wonderful little treatise on the body. He says, what is surely most curious and extraordinary about our brain is how largely unnecessary it is. To survive on Earth, you don't need to be able to write music or engage in philosophy. You really only need to be able to outthink a quadruped. So why have we invested so much energy and risk in producing mental capacity that we don't really need? This is just one of the many things about your brain that your brain won't tell you. Now, another way of putting what I'm trying to express here is that consciousness is for what we might call disinterested pursuits. This is a philosophical terms. It means it's not about what it actually does to support your biological life. They're pursuits that go well beyond the merely material, food and warmth and shelter. And here our consciousness, our within, is endowed with almost boundless possibility. Abraham Joshua Heschel puts it like this: there is more potentiality in his soul than in any other being known to us. Look at an infant and try to imagine the multitude of events it is going to engender. One child called Bach was charged with power enough to hold generations of men in his spell. Augustine put it like this: the sense of wonder in terms of what we're capable of. Don't you believe that there is in man a deep so profound as to be hidden even to him in whom it is? So because of consciousness, we are capable of wonders that so clearly don't belong to the material world. They extend beyond its borders. So for Johann Sebastian Bach, it meant that out of his internal world, his consciousness was the potential to bring the B minor mass into being. For Aristotle, it was the internal capability to bring forth his wonderful truth theorems, his laws of logic, so eloquent and so obviously true to reality. Now, ultimately, consciousness opens up a horizon for relationship. Again, beyond the border of the material. This is what philosophers call the intersubjective, subject to subject, the ability to relate from the center of my consciousness to the center of another conscious being. Martin Buber calls this the I-you, conscious self to conscious self. And he says, real life is meeting, this kind of relationship between conscious beings. So when one self-conscious being relates to another self-conscious being, human existence has reached its peak. Now I'm saying that's a horizon beyond the border of nature and the material. And it's only because of consciousness that we can have relationship. Now, ultimately, our inner world, our consciousness, opens up the horizon to enter a intersubjective relationship with the God who made us. A being who's personal and a being who himself has consciousness. So our ability here allows for an intersubjective relationship with God. And in Genesis 2:7, where we're told that God breathed his spirit into humans, this is ultimately what it was for. That's the ultimate account for why we're conscious. God breathed it into us. He made us like this, and this is his greatest gift and endowment. Not an illusion, not a nothing, but his gift for relationship. And because of this gift, we have ultimately a capability to know him. As our self is not a delusion, neither is he. And it is possible to know him. the great divine being. And that is why ultimately we have this immense inner universe. We were created for relationship with him, the great God who made heaven and earth. Now, this is something that the mystics knew. I actually enjoy the mystics for lots of reasons. Not all of them, but many of them. They were masters of the interior life of human beings. And it was Teresa of Avila, famous woman, a mystic in the 16th century, who coined the phrase the interior castle. It's a vision of the soul as a diamond. And this diamond is in the shape of a castle that has 7 great wings. And for her, these were mansions of our being with the potential for communion with God. So I'm arguing that facing up to the wonder of consciousness is the key to our re-enchantment. If science alone gets to define what consciousness is, it can only lead to disenchantment. And finally, to the inevitable conclusion, we are self-conscious nothings living in the delusion of being real. Now, that's a conclusion that I think doesn't make sense of the evidence. And I would suggest it's ultimately a terribly dehumanizing explanation of what we are. You look at a human person, and the evidence is there. Something about us is a castle of infinite worth and value. So let me leave it there. I leave you with a quote that I ended with last week from Fyodor Dostoevsky. Man is a mystery. It needs to be unraveled. And if you spend your whole life unraveling it, don't say that you wasted time. I am studying that mystery because I want to be a human being. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you ever so much, Andrew. We move now to a 5-minute intermission, after which we'll commence a Q&A, a time of interactive questions. Before we do that, just to let you know, just to signal how you ask questions. So if you want to use this time to pose some, you can do that. You can use the Q&A tab on the bottom right. You'll see how to type questions in there. Alternatively, you can raise your hand by going to the Participants tab and clicking on your own name. There should be something that says More. And then you should be able to see the option to raise your hand. Alternatively, it might be, no, that should be where it is. Let me know if you have any problems. But we'll go now to a 5-minute break. There's time to boil the kettle again, or charge your glasses, or put another log on the fire. And then in 5 minutes, we'll come back, see who's got their hands raised, and see what questions there are. Thanks very much. Wonderful. Let's make a start with our Q&A session. Please feel free to continue to add or raise your hand if you'd like to contribute verbally. And I'll try and catch you there. We'll start with a question from Ian Cooper. Does hypnosis rather dent the idea that consciousness is that special? Andrew.
Oh, thank you, Ian. Yeah, hypnosis. I'm not sure for me it dents it being special. It reflects the last point I was making, that something quite remarkable is possible on the intersubjective, that one conscious being can have a remarkable influence over another, and potentially a destructive influence. So for me, I would say it elevates it, but I'd be interested maybe to hear from you how you think it could take it in the other direction. I can't think of a reason.
Ian, would you like to speak on that subject for a second? I can give you the microphone if you'd like. You should be able to speak if you unmute.
Hi, can you hear?
Yes.
You're loud and clear.
No, just as having been as a student and watched the most remarkable examples of hypnosis, which we were sort of reduced to gasps and in the ways in which people, yes, they voluntarily allowed themselves to undergo it, but it seemed as though they were so much under control that somehow or other the idea of consciousness being something which involved intention, involved self-awareness, and all these sorts of things seem to disappear completely.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm only sort of, in a sense, offering a devil's advocate view of things, but I wondered if people have used that argument at all. I mean, it's a slightly off the cuff, but it was just something that intrigued me.
Yeah. No, I'd have to think about it more, but I think we can surrender certain things in our consciousness in an unhelpful manner. We're going to get to that in my fourth talk when we look at knowledge, that we're knowledge beings. But yeah, we can be naive and be taken over by others. That for me just shows that it's not fixed, but it also reflects not something less than special, that it's a marvel. And the fact that people can have mind control over another human being, wow, that again, I find that an argument that is rather enchanting, if not frightening. Yeah. Thank you.
Wonderful. We've got a question here from James Goodwin Hudson. Hi there, James. This idea that we are a self-conscious nothing sounds very similar to Hinduism or Buddhism. In what ways does this materialistic understanding differ from that?
Yeah, excellent question. In a sense, materialism and Buddhism, Eastern pantheism share this in common. It's a form of monism. All is one. And a physicalist, in a sense, is close to a Buddhist in asserting that all reality can be reduced to one. The Eastern doesn't take it in the physicalist direction, but it does. They share this in common. They're monist worldviews. And I think if you're a monist, you can't cope with tensions. You certainly can't cope with duality. And that's where I started. Our natural intuitive sense of ourselves is this dual aspect of within and without. And you see that Buddhists tend to deny and Eastern pantheists tend to deny the material over the other. So I think it's a great question. I think they're quite different, but they can end up in similar places. And like you say, I think in many respects, a Buddhist is trying to get beyond any categorization, which would include being a self. So I think I would agree with you there that the ultimate end would be to get beyond consciousness and to become the nothing, to be absorbed into the oneness. So excellent question.
We've got an anonymous question. Today, with the view that all creatures are nothing more than Homo sapiens, scientists are trying to make a case for blurring the lines between animals and human beings, trying to show how animals suffer, feel, and are conscious beings worthy of flourishing. To ignore animal suffering is to repress suffering. And the question is, how does one respond to this from a Christian perspective?
Yeah. Yes, again, a very thoughtful question. I have no doubt in my mind at all. I have an agricultural background, husbandry, pets galore through my life. So I know animals can suffer. But I would say the suffering of an animal is quite different from the suffering of a human, principally because we can reflect on our suffering. We have an awareness of it, which brings, and this is where Thomas Ligotti is very interesting, it brings horror to it. And so he argues that the horror dimension of human suffering is different from animal suffering, even though he thinks we're just animals. But he thinks this is where we have a damning surplus of consciousness, because in that horror goes with suffering. So I think there's a distinction between awareness of suffering. So I know some people quibble with this. An elephant is lost in the tribe, and there seems to be some sense that the fellow elephants are affected by that. But I would say when an animal suffers loss, its awareness of that loss is nothing like a human that goes through grief that can last for years and years and years.
We've got a question from Kate Townsend, who says that she's going to pick up your answer. Unfortunately, they had to step out, but she'll pick up your answer on the recording. Thank you for a wonderful presentation, she writes. One aspect which I think was perhaps sidestepped was how one might try to understand the relationship between consciousness and the brain if and when one resists the view that consciousness must be reduced to the brain. Do you have a preference for a view that consciousness represents a kind of non-material entity, mind, or a so-called emergent property, which arises from but is distinct from the brain? Or are you deliberately agnostic on this point?
Great question, Kate. Yeah, these are big issues. For me, I don't have a problem asserting that without the brain, there would be no consciousness. So in that sense, I guess a kind of emergent view. But to say that consciousness itself is the brain, sometimes this is reflected as the soul is the brain, is something I can't do. And in that sense, I believe as Christians, we have to hold the dual nature of a human. We have a within, we have a without. These are perfectly integrated. And actually, when they're separated, they don't work. The separation of our body and the within is death. That's what death is, according to the Bible. Exactly how it works, I'm going to say I am an agnostic on that. There's different kinds of dualism which I don't like. Others, one known as hylomorphic dualism, I have sympathy for. These are questions that philosophers have dealt with for centuries, but I'm certainly not of the opinion that you can have consciousness without the brain. But then again, it raises the question, what happens when we die? Do we cease to be conscious? Do we enter a kind of soul sleep? And I don't think the Bible teaches that. So, big questions, big issues issuing from them. But in terms of our present body condition, we are embodied spirits, and those are a perfect unity. I hope that begins to get to your very good question.
Just to say, please do feel free to raise your hand or to ask a question in the Q&A. And we've got a few more minutes left dedicated for Q&A, so feel free. Andrew, I just wondered if I could put one to you. What do you think, in a nutshell, are the principal problems with a Christian physicalism, or a Christian desire to maintain a position that's not dualistic?
Yeah, good question, Josh. I do hear Christians almost acting with embarrassment about any form of dualism, and for me, it just feels like they bought into naturalism, and it seems to be an embarrassment about, as I said at the end of my lecture, a horizon of reality that isn't reducible to the material. In that sense, I think it sounds to me often like a kind of accommodation. And I think we're not rejecting neuroscience. I think neuroscience is wonderful. I hope the BAM project works. I mean, they're taking on something that makes the Genome Project look like Mickey Mouse. This is huge. But I would say BAM, while giving us a marvelous understanding of how it works physiologically, wouldn't discount the supernatural dimension of consciousness itself, as I say, which is ungraspable. So even Darwin, his understanding that the frontal assault's not going to work, for me, it is this, what I call this inference to there is more to us than matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. If there is anyone here who did work on the Human Genome Project, please don't be offended.
Oh no, absolutely. It was very impressive. But I think I know someone who was involved in that, and they would have no problem saying, as massive as that was, this is a whole another kettle of fish, to put it like that.
Absolutely. Are there any last questions or perhaps concise comments? It's a rather unusual format, as I'm sure we're all finding. because as Buber did say, what was it, Andrew? Life consists of meeting. Life is meeting.
Real life is meeting.
Yeah.
That raises a lot of questions about this format. You're right.
Indeed, we can't see your faces. We can't observe whether you're looking quizzical or satisfied, cognitively satisfied. I think, however, the questions have run their course. Oh no, we have a last entry. So we'll go for one more. This one from Jesse Voth, and we're getting some comments that people are satisfied, which is wonderful. Have you encountered the philosopher Dr. Philip Goff's idea of panpsychism, which he uses to challenge the idea that the brain gives rise to consciousness? He posits that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the physical world. Any thoughts?
I know of this work, but I haven't engaged it. And Jesse, thank you for pushing it in my direction. The literature on this matter is enormous, as Metzinger says. This is the consciousness culture. So there's just so much to read. But from what you said, it sounds like it's an important book to engage. I actually have a copy. The more I've read on the subject, the more I see how much there is to read. Thank you for that. I can't make a comment. I don't know his particular view.
And one more from Laurie or Joe Klein. Do you think consciousness stays the same at some level throughout life?
Yes, it's a good question. I would say, as we experience consciousness, it's constantly changing and fluctuating. I woke up this morning feeling pretty bright and cheery. I woke up the day before not feeling so bright and cheery. So in a sense, there's a shift in my consciousness. So I think the state of our consciousness is constantly changing. And that's where the fluidity of our humanness comes in. In terms of across a long span, I would say if we're nurtured well as humans, the size of our inner world should keep growing. And I love elderly people, senior citizens who have what I call a well-nourished inner life. And you sense a gravitas about them, a weightiness about their bodies are pretty frail, but there's something internally. They look at you with their steely eyes and they think sharply, and you listen to what they read and what they're engaging in the arts and their capacity for relationship. You think, wow. So I think it's possible. This is what Paul says. Outwardly, we're wasting away, but inwardly, we're being renewed day by day. So that's a possibility that we can become weightier. This profundity of our inner life can become greater. Great question.
Wonderful. Well, we've reached the end of our time together this evening. Want to thank you all again for being with us for more exploration of the mystery of mankind, as Dostoevsky said. Andrew, thank you so much for what you've shared. Just to give you a heads up that next week we will be diving into the subject of the capacities of humanity. How do we account for the astonishing range of capacities that we have as human beings when there are so many efforts to boil them down, to reduce them to something much more elemental? And Andrew will be leading us in thinking that through. Same time, same place, different link. Please do go to the website if you haven't registered for that on the events page. But until then, we hope you have a wonderful week and hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Goodbye.